Now, the last extended presentation of the day, of the weekend, we hear Stathis Gourgouris, whom we've been hearing, fortunately, these last few days. Stathis has been an essential member of the collective for some years now, too, and has been very active in many of our special issues and projects, and keeping us committed to certain basic critical projects of that have defined our work, particularly around these categories of secularism and secular criticism of a worldly literature and a worldly body of scholarly work for studying that literature. Stathis has so many wonderful books. And by wonderful, I mean, among other things, books that have helped me and I have felt to be myself in dialogue with. I will mention just one or two of them. Most recently, and I think if you haven't read it, you should really rush off and read a book called The Perils of One, which is a recent text that is key to his ongoing project. That has included a book which is, for me, perhaps even more important, a book called Does Literature Think? And if you read that book carefully, I think you'll see that I have read it carefully. And you'll also hear some of its dialogue with the paper. We have just had a chance.
I admit I've read that book.
Yes, as well. And Lessons in Secular Criticism, another title, which is crucial, and goes hand in hand with Stathis' work in the journal and the production of special issues around the questions of secular criticism and worldly literature. His work is vast in its reach. Translations, he's himself an internationally important poet in more than one language. He is a vitally valuable translator of languages and literatures, including not only the Greek and English. His work is scattered throughout the areas of the Mediterranean, and I discovered recently into Japanese. I didn't know that.
Yes.
Right. In Japanese. I'm sure he'll want to tell you something about the time he gives to the management of the systems of administration at Columbia, but he may wait. I want to mention a somewhat older book that has just been reissued, a book called Dream Nation, which is the forceful examination of the transformation of imagination of Greece. It's been reissued, of course, by Stanford University Press because of the historic celebration by Greece of the anniversary of its independence. Recently, I should have it here with me as I have the special issue on Charles Bernstein. I simply don't. Boundary 2, fortunately, was able to publish something we call the Cavafy dossier, which contains previously unseen materials from the Cavafy archives that themselves grew out of a conference in Athens. And I strongly recommend it to you because it not only recasts the sense of Cavafy and so of the history of Greek and Eastern Mediterranean poetry. And this is a vitally important part of that collection because it very much ties the character of Cavafy in Greek literature to Egypt and to the other parts of what we call now the Middle East. Strongly urge you to take a look at that. But it's just one of the many ways in which Stathis has done something that I'm very proud to know that he has done, that is, make something valuable out of the resources of the journal, which I have, for at least for some period of time, tried to shepherd to this moment. Today, his paper is No More Artificial Anthropisms, and I know that it comes as a key expression of his attempt to complete his long-standing project, of which the book on the One is a part. So, Stathis.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank Don for the generous hospitality. And this has been a tremendous weekend. Every paper has been riveting. I do, because we are in an anniversary situation. I want to thank Paul Beauvais for being, I will not use the word shepherd, which is used, because there's too many Christian overtones for me. But I want to thank him for being a tremendous, sublime orchestrator of a bunch of intellectual Looney Tunes. And given to highly opinionated and argumentative nature, in really orchestrating a conversation over many years, which has been invaluable to me. I know that we've been through 2 days of intensity, and I feel bad to have to continue this here for you. I will get to this as quickly as possible so that we will be relieved as quickly as possible. I want to contextualize just very quickly, just to say that in the tradition of what we do here, I'm presenting material that I've not presented before. It is the last section of a monstrous, in terms of length, essay that's now over 150 pages long, which is called Humanism, Human Animal, Human Being. I've published part of it in the journal, which is an attempt. It's half of my book Nothing Sacred, which completes the secular criticism series. The other half of this book is called the essay, similar length, is called Democracy's Anarchy. Dawn's presentation has really actually solved some dead ends for me just an hour ago, which is kind of amazing. But anyway, the essay Humanism, Human Animal, Human Being attempts to reconsider the notion of the human as both a social, historical, and ontological category against the traditional ways that both on the social historical front and on the ontological front have been conducted. So I'm not going to read the paper is too long. I'm only going to read about 2/3 of it, and so Paul, at the 35th minute you have to hit me, because there's no way I can repeat Lindsay's performance of looking at my phone. So when I began writing this section in 2019, multiple fires were blazing through the Amazon rainforest with inextinguishable force, and a network whose expanse at one point was equivalent to the width of the continent of Europe from Lisbon to Kiev, making altogether tangible the assessment that the region is at the tipping point of irreversibly switching from canopy forest formation to open grassland, from rainforest to savanna. In 2019 alone, the Amazon rainforest suffered more than 73,000 fires, an 84% increase from the year before. In the same year, the typical worldwide summerfest of wildfires included, in addition to what by now has become routine in California, the biggest fire ever to assault the forests of Siberia, burning an area of more than 11,000 square miles, and of course the inconceivable horror of the bushfires in Australia, in which 15 million acres of land burned and 3 billion animals killed or irreparably disrupted, with no precise sense as to possible species extinction in the continent's native flora and fauna. Less than a year later, in the autumn 2020, the Pacific Northwest wildfires burned 80% of the Oregon forest in just a few days. Yet even further, in 2021, most of the planet's unburned forests, from California to Siberia and from the Mediterranean to southern Africa, went up in flames under scorching temperatures that broke all records. A new meteorological term was invented, the heat dome, which, like its keen opposite, the polar vortex, has become the new norm in a planetary atmospheric ecosystem that's collapsing from the stratosphere down to the deepest ocean floor. While vast and catastrophic forest fires have horrifically become routine events of climate change, in many cases, including both the Amazon and Australia, the hand of land speculators, extraction companies, and corrupt governments is demonstrably the cause. Of course, the two are the same. Climate change is a misnomer. It's surely not a natural shift, not even a natural disaster, despite the fact that in the vast expanse of geological time going backwards, the planet has had substantial phases of heating and cooling, which are unfathomable to the human mind. 56 million years ago, the planet warmed 5 to 8 degrees Celsius after expelling 5,000 gigatons of carbon over a period of 5,000 years. It took the planet 150,000 years to cool off back to its previous temperatures. Geologists call this the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, which they identify significantly not as an epoch, but as an event. It is hardly unique in geological history. 38 million years prior to this event, the planet had also warmed up around 8 degrees Celsius because of extraordinary CO2 emissions that depleted half the oxygen of the seas. To give an idea, at this point, we're looking at 2% oxygen depletion of the seas. This is called the Cretaceous Oceanic Anoxic Event 2, and it lasted 500,000 years. I'm only mentioning 2 out of a number of such events, which themselves are but little dots buried in the chasms of geological time, often just mere particles of epochs that are themselves organized, mapped, and named by geologists according to a whole lot of factors way beyond the scope of these events, which may have caused mass extinction of life forms, but geologically speaking, are rather insignificant. In fact, geological history in its unfathomable expanse makes all human perspectives ridiculous. It certainly makes me wonder whether the sort of text that you're now hearing was ever worth writing. And while there is a certain merit to thinking of the human in both zoological and social historical framework, nonetheless, elevating the human to any sort of geological scale is absurd. To say the least, because, in fact, it is testament to the arrogance of this animal that sees nature not as its context, but as its object, to be made and unmade as it pleases. And yet we're surrounded by the clamor that we're currently undergoing, the age of the Anthropocene, since the Dutch Nobelist atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen introduced and popularized the term in a series of articles and announcements around the dawn of the millennium. The basic argument for the Anthropocene is conducted in geological terms, but is derived from the discourse of atmospheric chemistry and centers around the fact that the extensive production of chlorofluorocarbon emissions by human activity has altered significantly the planet's environment, both on the ground and in the atmosphere. Dating the onset of the Anthropocene varies. It is usually thought to coincide with the invention of the steam engine and the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. Some thinkers extend it either backward, 500 years ago, with the conquest of the Americas, which precipitated mineral extraction, slave labor, and intercontinental exchange of flora and fauna at an unprecedented scale, or forward to 80 years ago, with the invention of the atomic bomb and the onset of the nuclear age. There have also been suggestions that the Anthropocene must be defined in terms of the trajectory of Homo sapiens on this planet and its interference with the Earth's biosphere since the first days of agriculture. But even then, if we consider that geological measurements of epochs come with a plus or minus 50,000 years margin of error, the very assessment of the Anthropocene signifies a radical reconfiguration of the entire framework of geology, nullifying the status of stratigraphic evidence and upturning temporal order to the point where the epistemological structure of geology as a science is alienated beyond recognition. There is a counter-perspective that takes the Anthropocene as a geological epoch that has not yet happened. Or more precisely, it identifies it as happening now only to the degree that it sets into motion an irreversible future. What is currently already traceable as global warming is catastrophic to the extent that it stands to determine the Earth's climate for the next 100,000 years, derailing the projected next ice age by a margin of between 50 and 500,000 years. Now, this is a proper geological scale, except for the uncanny aspect of its being qualified not as something that belongs to the Earth's sedimented history, to its already being physically what it is, but to its becoming something else. Key here is David Archer's argument that the current use and certain depletion of the Earth's carbon fuel deposits is creating, as we speak, future carbon deposits that will become the archaeological evidence of geological activity by an animal species millions of years after it will have been extinguished. This may in fact be the most insightful argument regarding the Anthropocene, but because it is not archaeological in the way that geology is structured by definition, and is rather oriented towards an imaginative terrain, it belongs to the realm of the humanities and not of science, strictly speaking. Of course, that's neither here nor there. Certainly in a group like this, you understand what is properly scientific after all, or what is properly humanistic after all. These are contested and surely intersecting domains. In the end, the strictly scientific status of the Anthropocene is fully open to debate, no matter that a range of scientists, including geologists, are actively engaged with the idea. Discrediting it straight out, however, runs the risk of arming further the arsenal of climate change denial, most of which is mobilized and funded by the petrochemical and extraction industries and their political servants. There is, alas, another ally to this doubt that comes from certain radical ecology circles that scoff at the significance of the human factor relative to planetary magnitude. Such arguments, forwarded by, for example, James Lovelock and the purveyors of the Gaia hypothesis, or bona fide misanthropists like John Gray, look forward to the innate mechanism of self-protection that planet Earth is already mobilizing by making life conditions of humans intolerable until their guaranteed eventual extinction will thankfully return the planet to its intrinsic physical self-balance. In this respect, perhaps the singular utility of the Anthropocene concept is polemical, serving above all the needs of climate change activism, including the intellectual work that might serve as a platform for activist practices. It's not surprising in this regard that the term has great purchase in the humanistic social sciences, particularly in certain strands of anthropology, environmental studies, and eco-criticism, which is why it's appropriate for us to consider here in the tail end of an argument about the significance of human animality and the peculiarity of human being. To be sure, I take for granted, and without the least doubt, that the planet is endangered by the way of life of the human animal. The very fact that all life on this planet can be irreparably altered by nuclear catastrophe is enough to seal the point. And the further fact that such a nuclear catastrophe would not be an aberration, but a mere extension of a way of life already in place for some centuries before nuclear power was even invented, takes this matter out of the narrow orbit of a singular event and into deeply embedded diachronic structures and institutions of social organization. No discussion of planetary environmental calamity can be disengaged from the specific psychosocial imagination that creates and sustains the techno-economic power of what we call capitalism in all its variants, historically actualized or potentially imagined. In these terms, planetary environmental catastrophe can neither be considered in itself, say, as a matter of nature disengaged from history, nor, on the other hand, considered as an extension of mere human being, which is what the category Anthropocene ultimately does, regardless how one might date its emergence. For to deal in matters of history, which is always history of societies for me, means that whatever is the ontological domain, be it anthropic or geological, it is always temporal and heterogeneous, not reducible to an essence. From this standpoint, the Anthropocene has no real geological meaning, nor ontological for that matter. It is part of an ontological inquiry and therefore belongs here only to the extent that it's conceptualized within a broader historical formation in the course of human existence. In these terms, the historical form that gives rise to the Anthropocene as an event, and surely as an interpretive framework, is nothing less than capitalism, pure and simple. This seems a no-brainer to me, and there is a trail of important arguments to spell it out, most influential of which is, of course, Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. Nonetheless, this position remains hotly contested, because even though the Anthropocene may not be entirely coherent as a geological notion, it has set in motion an epistemological framework with its own projections as to what politics necessitates. From this perspective, some people argue that just as capitalism may not be the cause of the Anthropocene, but rather an enabler of its acceleration, the abolition of capitalism will not avert planetary catastrophe. The most vocal and celebrated thinker disputing an exclusive association between climate and capitalism is, of course, as you know, Dipesh Chakrabarti, who has become a formidable figure in this discussion since the publication of his influential essay, The Climate of History, 2009, and an array of elaborations still ongoing. Key to Chakrabarti's intervention is that he speaks as a historian. It is history as the existential epitome of the human animal that concerns him the most. Yet, strangely, the arena of history has become nebulous in this discussion for both Chakrabarti and his critics, since they're all drawn swiftly into the gravity orbit of the Anthropocene framework, thereby strengthening it as a metaphysical structure that thrives on apocalyptic discourses very much against the grain of its quintessentially physical meaning. Chakrabarti rightly points to an extraordinary difference in temporal scale between the politics of climate change and anti-capitalist politics. For the politics of climate change is conducted in the present for the future in a way that is concrete, even if unfathomable, unlike, say, the messianic politics of communist revolution, whose deferred future remains inevitably abstract. I'm just paraphrasing his argument. From this same standpoint, one can equally argue that the politics of climate change is difficult to entwine with an anti-capitalist politics of democracy. For democracy is always a politics of the present, regardless of what might be its own utopian future vision or its constitutional or legal ancestry. While, I repeat, the complicity between capitalism and climatic catastrophe is indisputable, what's valuable in Chakrabarti's position is precisely this matter of scale and the disjunction this produces in our inherited parameters of how politics comes to signify human being, including the time and space of action, the permutations of desire and vision, and the reflection all this has on matters of daily living. So I'm going to skip here a bit and then move on to what are two, for me, main directions of critique to Chakrabarti's position. First is the problem that Srinivasa Ravamudan, in a series of brilliant essays on environmental criticism late in life before his unfortunate passing, identified as catachronism. Specifically, and I quote, the inversion of anachronism, which characterizes the backlash of the Anthropocene as post-human nomenclature, especially insofar as similar to anachronism that reimagines the past in terms of the present, catachronism recharacterizes the past and the present in terms of a future proclaimed as determinate, but of course not fully realized. The emphasis here should be placed on the tension between the words determinate and not fully realized, the phrases. That is to say, the peculiar notion of something that has not yet happened, and in this sense does not exist, carrying the full force of real material determination on what exists and what will presumably continue or come to exist. Ravamudan immediately points to what he sharply calls the theological grasp of time that underlines this notion, which celebrates catastrophe as a catachronistic history that inexorably begins to reverse the Enlightenment, unquote, by reminding us that more than anything, catastrophology has become so prominent because, as he says, it is oddly comforting. Not so oddly, I would add, and I imagine very well he would have agreed, because this whole discursive machine of which the Anthropocene is, as a name, is both a sign and a symptom, is predicated on naturalized narrations of the general story of human misery, exploitation, and damage over history. These are his words. Perhaps not oddly, but surely comforting nonetheless, because this image of catastrophe, no matter its indisputable reality, is a narcissistic extension of what human beings do in the most banal sense of the phrase. Hence the reason why catastrophology has fostered such anti-humanist vehemence, which is the immediate second order of humanist narcissism disguised as self-critique. All proclaimed adoration of other sentient life from the privileged standpoint of the human as anti-human expression is part of this narcissism complex, in the sense that only humans can be anti-human, for the psychic benefit of being human ad absurdum. Aravamudan thus presents a radical challenge to Chakrabarti and his followers, and one can only regret that his hapless death prevented us from having the full force of such a debate. His position resonates with me especially because of his relentless attention to how arguments about history can so easily shift into arguments about nature, an intellectual sensitivity that we all owe to the best of Marx. I quote again, "The move from history to geology with the application of the concept of the Anthropocene shifts a social science of life evolving over time and within a lived environment to a natural science of species death discovered afterward as a geological stratum of so many fossils of life once lived," unquote. Utterly succinct. The shift he describes not only naturalizes history, but also occludes and indeed occults any radical attempt to reconfigure the terrain of ontology away from the ubiquitous desire to turn it into metaphysics. It is this metaphysical desire that attaches ontology to the apocalyptic imagination and turns discussions of being and of nature into discussions about ends, in fact, the end, which is itself epistemically fraudulent because it silences the history of endings of innumerable societies and populations, which in recent centuries capitalism and all its substructures, I'm not going to list them, has precipitated at an unprecedented scale. As I said earlier, the Anthropocene discussion is fully permeated by theological desire. But what's particularly dire in this observation is how this theological discussion claims to possess the future as an always already determined formation. From a political standpoint, this is a politics of eschatology, a politics of ends without means, and what's worse, a politics that loses sight of the fact that endings are also mutations. Indeed, in essence, beginnings, very much in Said's sense of the term. A profound reminder for even a politics of reversal of such a projected end, as is climate change activism at its best, cannot possibly achieve this aspiration if it's a politics based on ontological certainty, human or planetary, self or other. Now, the second significant questioning of the Chakrabarti position in this whole epistemology comes from the standpoint of Black studies. And if Aravamudan's critique unmasks the Anthropocene as a theological discourse formation that turns history into nature, this critique points to the Anthropocene's profound historical failure as a political perspective. It thus addresses, even if not directly, the arguments Chakrabarti makes about climate change as a whole other way of historical thinking by pointing to a stunning denial of essential aspects of human history in the last 500 years, namely the nexus of planetary conquest, extraction of the Earth's material wealth, slave labor, and reification of human bodies that starts with the Spanish conquest of the Americas and persists unabated to this day. From this perspective, any doubt as to whether climate change politics is beyond capitalism is rendered nonsensical at best, ahistorical, and indeed racist at worst. The work in this direction is huge, complex, and still evolving for me to give a full account of it here. It partakes of a number of concurrent debates on blackness, Afropessimism, the ontology of the slave, mineral extraction, capitalism, as well as the entire continental symbolic significance of the Americas, which do not address Anthropocene politics per se. Yet much of the formidable work of thinkers I admire, Hortense Spillers, Ronald Judy here, my colleagues Saidia Hartman, Fred Moten, Achille Mbembe, and a host of other younger interlocutors, as well as, of course, Sylvia Wynter, whose astonishing conceptualizations from decades ago still preside, is essential not only to this specific section, but to my problematic overall, extending in many ways, but also going beyond the arguments made by anti-colonial humanists of the 1930s, 1960s. This is a reference to a whole section I have earlier in the essay about anti-colonial humanism. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Wynter here. Judging from Wynter's perspective, there is a certain libidinal economy of geology that capitalism holds at its deepest folds of its core. The desire for extraction, initially of gold and later of coal and oil, which fuels the settler conquest of the Americas, is tantamount to the liquidation of human bodies, initially indigenous Americans and soon thereafter African slaves. The equation must be understood in the strictest possible material terms. Bodies and minerals become one and the same, and both serve their mutual liquidation into capital through a process of unfathomable brutality, where to speak of dehumanization, even if accurate, is hardly adequate. Instead, what we cannot afford to lose sight of is that geology and biology are disciplines which develop their language and their very scientific stature precisely in these conditions, and as beneficiaries of gigantic enterprises of liquidating earthly matter, mineral and human both, at once and indistinguishably. And I think the same could be said about biopolity, which is a certain kind of geophysics of power and being, right? I mean, etc. So I'll move on. In this context, unlike in discourses of post-humanism, the inhuman achieves far more significant meaning than its mere antithesis to the human, for it is materially coincident with the inhumane. And this takes place at a world-making scale, where human beings engaged in a creative enterprise through an unfathomable destruction of what is earthly, human and inhuman alike. This engagement is racialized with such vehemence that whatever was deemed to be humanist about it was de facto implicated in the tearing apart of any ontological integrity of human being. The contradiction was occulted beyond recognition, so that, say, the humanist desire of Bartolomé de las Casas in the 16th century to save the Amerindians by pronouncing them children of God delivered them even more insidiously into their complete subjugation and ultimate annihilation of the history and culture. This new geophysics of being, upon which the Anthropocene dates its historical trajectory, was always instrumental. And on this basis, human being itself has been, thus far, irreparably rent asunder by a racial differentiation that made some humans fodder in the entwinement of the inhuman with the inhumane. From this standpoint, the Anthropocene argument that sees environmental activism as independent or transcendent of anti-capitalism becomes scandalous. The specific mineral extraction and plantation systems that emerge with the conquest of the Americas are neither external to capitalism by being presumed to historically precede it, nor anomalous relative to capitalism's central signification of unattached global circulation of money. Here, Winter is again groundbreaking with a nod to Cyril James's understanding of the Haitian Revolution. I quote, Winter. Both the hegemony of the Western bourgeoisie and of capitalism were in their origin based mainly on New World land, the forced labor of the Indian, and the conversion of man, the black man, into a commodity. The later large-scale dehumanization of the European proletariat followed and did not precede the total negation of the black as human. Capitalism as a system, therefore, required the negation of the black as human. Far from being an anomaly in the rational system of capitalism, black slavery was rationally central to capitalism as a system. She wrote this in the 1970s. Keep that in mind, 77. Why the epistemology of the Anthropocene is predicated on futurity thus emerges in sharp relief. Blind to this racialized production of the coincidence of the inhuman with the inhumane, the Anthropocene logic negates extinctions of being that had already taken place, extinctions, moreover, that are essential to the machinery of future extinctions that the Anthropocene announces. This logic is thus ahistorical, not only in the sense that it continues to suppress the history of violence in how anthropos has come to be categorized as integral ontology, thus recirculating the effacement of difference in the universal, but also in the sense that it projects an integral futurity under the sign of the planet it purports to save, without doing anything to save the planet's genocidal history from oblivion. From this perspective, the Anthropocene as concept name categorization is yet another instance of coding the human, according to how Winter, following Fanon, has elaborated as the sociogenic principle. In this case, a coding instance that perpetuates the convenient disavowal of human being as a social formation with different species content, with different anthropo-ontological situations, in the name of yet another iteration of the human as a natural principle. This disavowal involves the obliteration of a genocidal history internal to human being to such an extent that it has become part of its code. Winter would say it's ontogenic, that is a neural code, though sociogenically generated. The genocidal history of what is thereby repressed in the bioeconomy of modern humanism, liberal capitalist humanism, with the conquest of the Americas as the departure point, is a powerfully determined sociogenic principle that continues to fuel a vast reproduction of human practices across societies and cultures on a planetary scale, which certainly include, as Winter says, elaborate mechanisms of self-occultation. Fanon's notion of colonization as a specific mode of production of human species belongs to this trajectory. His militant call for the disappearance of these means of production, as well as the species that is brought forth, is very much a call against such self-occultation, which is why it exceeds the event of mere political decolonization in the name of national independence. As political as his thinking is, its radical impetus fails to register, as long as one considers the political as superstructure to the ontological. Fanon's incomparably pointed reiteration of the fact that all humans wear cultural masks, which effectively mediate and indeed override their biological skins, is not just an indictment of the brutal psychological states created by racism. By foregrounding the psychosexual inner workings of racism, Fanon goes even further to stage a radical ontological argument, for the sociogenic principle is not just a referent to social constructions, but produces actual and indisputable modes of living being down to the neural core. This is the key to Winter's powerful argument about both humanism and human being. Following alongside Fanon the work of radical cognitive philosopher David Chalmers, Winter conducts an idiosyncratic, baroque, but nonetheless formidable argument about the neuro-ontological dimensions of the sociogenic principle, dismantling thus both traditional humanism's occulted cultural universals and traditional ontology's uninterrogated certainties. In this sense, although she never quite phrases it this way, Winter is fully engaged with the problematic of the human animal as a political entity, following how it was first articulated by Aristotle's notion of zoon politikon, where politics indeed institutes a regime of being. This is her phrase. Since his I'm getting near the end. Since his groundbreaking work, The Conscious Mind, Chalmers has notoriously argued that human consciousness is autonomous from physical operation, despite the brain being and functioning like any other physical organ. Of course, to the degree that the brain is a physical organ of the body, some sort of proposition of mind-brain split has occupied thinkers since antiquity. But Chalmers goes far enough to argue that the phantasms of the mind, along with their immense and complex affective states, not only are autonomously created by consciousness and are not reducible to the electromagnetic work of brain synapses, but also produce such synapses as instruments of actualization of mental states in the physical body. I'm gesturing to Dawn. By analogy, which Winter radically exploits, Fanon dares to describe the experience of racism as a sort of neurologically affected genetic mutation. I quote, this quote is famous, I'm sure you know it. The black man who has lived in France for a length of time returns to his native land radically changed. To express it in genetic terms, his phenotype undergoes a definitive and absolute mutation. Winter reads Chalmers armed with Fanon. She goes on to argue that when it comes to human being, the genetically programmed processes of ontogenesis, present in all living being, take place alongside with and are directly transformed by symbolically encoded processes of sociogenesis. The neurophysiological mechanisms of the brain may have their own biochemical dimensions, without which they cannot operate, but the conditions of living knowing that they produce are never mere extensions of biochemistry, for biochemistry itself ultimately operates in the service of code-producing mechanisms of affect meaning. Here, code is entirely translatable to mechanisms of neurotransmission, with effects going in both directions, where affect meaning will produce neural impulses and can also be the recipient of neural impulses in order to translate them into affect meaning within the specific sociogenic systems pertinent to every human. I quote Winter again, channeling Chalmers with Fanon very much in the background. The always already socialized and therefore symbolically coded orders of consciousness through which we experience ourselves as this or that mode of the human, have to be seen as an expression of mutation in the processes of evolution, one by means of which a new level of existence discontinues with evolution, she underlines, is brought into existence, or rather brings itself into existence. Therefore, this is a level whose self-instituting modes of being will respond to and know its order of reality, not in the species-specific sense of its genome, of its genomic principle, but in the genre-specific terms of a narratively prescribed master code or sociogenic principle. If you know Winters, this is a classic formulation. That is to say, there is no human being as biocentric being. Human animality itself is comprehensible only as a complex process of hybrid ontogenic sociogenic entwinement, where biological and or zoological components are mere ciphers. Although never exhaustively answerable, the question of what is human is a function of what is humanized, and of how this what comes to be humanized, which always includes the what and how process by which it or part of it is indeed dehumanized. What is human is thus always something that becomes human, even in cases where its evident humanity is ontologically assaulted. In this sense, my argument converges with Zakiya Imans-Jackson's, her new book, Becoming Human, which is a fabulous book, for whom the case with which blackness is associated with dehumanization and animality paradoxically serves not only the logic of exclusion of blackness from the parameters of the human, but substantiates an a priori humanity in which blackness would eventually be absorbed and nullified in some reparative restoration. I mean, this is an extraordinary argument. I really suggest you read it. Instead, Jackson's insistence that racism produces a specific mode of humanization, Jackson insistence that racism produces a specific mode of humanization that gives meaning to blackness, albeit abject, also understands in a way similar to Fanon and Winter that racism works on the neural black body in epigenetic fashion. Epigenetic scientists contest the exclusive relation between DNA and phenotype by proposing a flexible system of interactive factors in which what is external, the sociogenic principle, and what is internal, the body's genetic structure, are entwined in such a way that what is self and what is environment is no longer categorically divided. Epigenetics examines how environments and social structures come into the body and how this interactive entwinement modulates the genomic structure in such a way that we can no longer simply say that the experience of the violence of poverty or racism or misogyny are secondary psychological factors, but rather entirely and physiologically incorporated. In Jackson's terms, they're part of the ongoing, though mutable, humanization of the species. Having said that, however, Jackson correctly also warns that despite the displacement of simply biocentric notions of being, epigenetics inheres a danger that is strangely complicit to liberalism's modes of subjugation. Her argument goes as following. If biology is made rather than given, then the paradigm can easily revert to a politics of will or choice, which ironically buttresses claims of the unwillingness of the poor, say welfare mothers, to overcome their situations. The acrobatic position of epigenetics between the physiological and the psychosociological is its main weakness. Namely, if we are to be serious about the physiological transformation of bodies because of psychosocial factors, then we cannot revert to mere sociological categories when we're striving to imagine therapeutic solutions. One category does not substitute for the other. Both must be pursued at one and the same time in their proper domains. So this is my last paragraph. Processes of being humanized, dehumanized, which are often simultaneous strains of the same action, ultimately presuppose an integral notion of the human according to different social imaginaries. But that is no more than a specific sociogenic reality. Even in its remarkable plurality through various histories and societies of human being on this planet, humanism is a precise example of such a sociogenic reality, even when its purpose has been to conceal this sociogenesis and present itself as a metaphysical or natural ontology. Indeed, the manifestation of the human as an inexhaustible question is best perceptible when sociogenesis is unconcealed. It's at this point that whatever about human beings categorized as ontological can be understood to be a matter of poiesis. Indeed, autopoiesis, as we have seen, which, to remember Maturana and Varela's groundbreaking thesis, is the basis of all organic life regardless. This should put to rest both the arrogance of discourses of the self and the fetishism of discourses of the other in equal measure. Autopoiesis is a process of self-othering, which by all accounts of microphysics we know so far, seems to be the operative principle of the universe. Autopoiesis is thus fully meaningful in a fundamental context of symbiosis, where no organism is anything other than an other to itself in a complex network of sibling others, even if in certain circumstances or proportions, these sibling others become adversaries or even more, at the limit, existential enemies. I'll stop here. Thank you. Time?
Perfect.
Oh, really? Incredible.
I was really intrigued by your concluding remarks about epigenetics, and I'm wondering if you see some potential in epigenesis as a way of thinking even temporally or in terms of the morphology, perhaps, of the self and other distinction. You know, is there a way that epigenetics, because of course the recent work in epigenetics is also saying that there's a kind of writing process that's happening. And I'm thinking of the work of Catherine Malibu, her book Before Tomorrow on epigenesis and rationality, which is also about Kant, because Kant, of course, also uses epigenesis to describe the relationship between a priori and a posteriori as an epigenetic process. Anyway, it seems like there could be something there that might have something maybe to do with this concluding point you're making about poiesis, and I wonder if you have...
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain irony that, what we call humanists have been conducting epigenetic thinking before the scientists. Meaning that, which of course was taken also to extremes, and, social constructivism gone wild. I mean, everything's artificial and so on. And which is something I'm combating, because I am trying to articulate a certain ontological level. I'm interested in that. I'm not going to let it go, either to the scientists or to the philosophers. So yes, of course, epigenetics is exactly that. I mean, insofar as self-environment are impossible to clearly demarcate, it is about that thing about self-othering. But it's great though. I mean, Jackson uses it to her advantage beautifully, but she's right though about the dangers in it, which we understand coming from, again, the humanities, social sciences. The idea that, everything is social constructivism again. Everything is epigenetic, and in the end, if you've got some problems, as I said, poor people got some problems which are due to their condition. Well, they better change their condition, as if they could, because this is really, I think, this is sort of the danger with taking these positions to their extremes, right? But in general, I'm in favor of the way of thinking in this direction in the domain of science. I think it's a very, very interesting, and I'm very happy they're doing it. And they will give us some data that will be very useful. But the perspective is very familiar to us. It's part of our training. I mean, what Winter says, the many genres of being human. That's the phrase, or the way that we code the human, via what I would call mythographic structures. So people have been thinking in those terms, but they never think of it as science. That's our problem. It's our mistake as humans, that we don't think of what we do as science. Okay, Paul, and then Ron.
Sorry, I was just thinking of the Maturana Varela,
Yeah.
which is what, 1970 or something?
Yeah, 74.
Attached to autopoiesis there is also the notion of emergence.
Yes.
And when I listen to the anti-Chalmers naturalists in
Right.
the reductivist forms of the sciences, they adapt a category of emergence to name consciousness as simply a higher form of the chemical biological activities that don't require any sort of explanation at all. I've always been annoyed by this kind of deep appropriation, right, of the category of emergence, which essentially reduces it to a kind of neo-Darwinian form of absolute naturalism that is almost fatalistic, you know, and unwilling to pay attention at all to anything like the actual existence of human beings as either community or in the social world. Any explanation for why the emergence is?
I mean, I don't think that we will ever convince, neuroscientists. I'm involved in a project now. I'm mentoring an old student of mine who is a literature student, who does psychoanalysis, of course, but who is now, in his program called Neuroscience and Neuroscience and Society. Okay, and I'm in the midst of neuroscientists. I mean, hardcore ones. And they're the best, the ones who are in this project, because the others won't even get near this project. They don't give a shit, basically. But it's very, very difficult for them to come to terms. When I talk poiesis and stuff to them, they look at me like, okay, what are you talking about? It's very difficult for them. They will always try to naturalize. Mm-hmm. And by naturalize means to think in terms of chemistry. I mean, because that's how they think at this point, electricity and chemistry. But it is a certain naturalization, and they get very uncomfortable. They don't know what to do. There's an epistemological gap here that I think it's our responsibility, not theirs. I actually believe that it's our responsibility to clear up, to create conditions for it that it could become better understood. Because they're not going to move from their position, but we can do the kind of work possibly, that some of them would see something to it. Many of these people are musicians, they're artists, and they separate this entirely from as if, creating music to them is just a brain function.
I was teaching with
a
very distinguished neuroscientist a while back. We were having this kind of argument about poetry and poetics, exactly this argument. The issue for him became very simple, that is, it was not reducible to a laboratory test.
Yeah. Just Paul asked half of the question I was going to ask, because I think there's a symmetry here, right?
Yeah.
Of course, Chalmers' work still remains to be controversial.
Oh, God.
Marcel Just has done some interesting longitudinal studies that lend support to the sociogenetic or the semiotic aspect of epigenesis, right? But there's that problem of the extreme on the science side that you address. There's also the problem of the other extreme that was there. By the way, of course, Sylvia is taking genre from Fanon's important remark about the genre of the human.
Oh, yeah.
And the other side, what came to mind as you were thinking was Girard and mimetic theory, which is the extreme of the humanistic approach to this, which can arrive precisely back at the theological solution, right?
Exactly.
Right? Because there's no way of getting out of the epigenetic trap, as it were, except through some sort of divine intervention. So Girard brings us back to Christ. So I'd like to hear you speak a bit more about how you deal with that, especially because you're doing the collaboration with the extremes.
Well, Girard has no place in my project. For the reasons you mentioned, I don't really know what to do with that stuff. So I just ignore it.
But it's the danger.
Well, but the point is, the naturalization and the theologizing and naturalizing is the same.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
it's the same exact gesture, and the fact that they don't see it boggles my mind. But so I don't know really how to answer it. I mean, in the practical sense that I refer to this as a practical case, we're mentoring this person together. So of course, we're forced by our we wanted to be this. It's not somebody who dragged us to made us do it. So we have a certain investment, and so that's why I was remarking on it. Here's like a group of people who are meant to collaborate. They have the same project. They're invested in the same thing with the same love for this person. But at a certain point they cannot. So this is a problem. As I said, I don't know. I mean, what I'm doing. This piece took just like 13 years, to get to the end. Okay, so I've erased it many times, changed my views many times. That's what I'm trying to do, and create a kind of language hopefully understandable, that can maybe speak to not us. I mean, I meant to say before, but I forgot that what I present here is not news to this audience. I mean, really, what I want to from you guys is really a reflection on the framework, on the whole framework. And that's what you're doing right now. How about this project as a whole. This is. Yeah, Tom.
It's a wonderful project, and I'm wondering at the place at which you bring this to a conclusion, Autopoiesis. I wonder if that site enables you to refer back to the points of transition in your active poiesis that results in this. Namely, how do you address the possibility of your being described through autopoiesis as producing a form of human, through autopoiesis, survival that overcomes your attribution of narcissism as an excess of that results in the desire to generate a sense of generalized extinction on the one hand, and how do you, on the other, since this is your other major site of transition, save the appearances of genocide? That is, if your way of getting to autopoiesis as a means of engaging sociogenesis and all the paradoxes of ontogenesis, and your means of getting to that beginning ending is through calling attention to the shortcomings of prior. They are all describable as acts of autopoiesis.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you, in a certain sense, sustain the movement that brings you there, and simultaneously occult or ward off the two primary accusations that enable you to shift from position to position?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. That's why I've been tortured for. That's why it's taken me so long. The only answer I can give, and that's why the other project, which is really about politics, is essential to this. There's discussion of ontology there too, but it's about politics. There's a certain politics here. That's what's different. I mean, in this, I'm not embarrassed to say there's something radically different about this animal, the human, compared to other animals. And it's a political animal. I mean, in a way, this whole project is a reflection on the notion political animal, except that I'm taking it very, very, seriously to the core, beyond Aristotle's, definition. And there is a politics, meaning that autopoiesis can be neutral in terms of value as a biocreative process, but it's never neutral in humans. There's, whatever is, because yes, of course, the most horrifying, absolutely, unfathomable notions that we can barely even put in our minds that have happened in reality that human beings have created are part of their autopoietic capacity. And there's also some psychoanalytic stuff there that I get into in elsewhere in the piece that is very important, that we need to get into that and figure out what are the psychic mechanisms going on. But in the end, there is politics, and so we can't just simply sit back and say just let this animal self-create. Because of course it's very likely to destroy everything. And so this is where the politics comes. That's the only thing I can say. But it's torturing me, this question. That is the kind of meta question.
Stathis, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.